everyone. I'm Nicole Curato. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, and you're watching the third episode of our Book Drop series. And today we are talking about the politics of the Anthropocene, or is it the Anthropocene? I think that's one of the most contentious issues in environmental politics today. The book is published by Oxford University Press and written by our very own University of Canberra Centenary Professor and Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow Professor John Dryzek, and our postdoctoral research fellow who works on the ARSD Laureate Project, Jonathan Pickering. So let's get going. All right, John, what's the thinking behind the book, and how different is it from all the books on environmental politics that you've published? The Politics of the Earth, third edition, just dropped a few years ago. You recently published Climate Challenge Society and Democratizing Global Climate Governance. So how is this book different from all those books?
Right. The short answer is that this book puts politics in geological time. So it does take the concept of the Anthropocene seriously. I'll maybe just say a few words about what the concept involves. The Anthropocene is the emerging epoch of human-induced instability in the Earth system. So increasingly Earth system scientists are using this idea. The Anthropocene is the successor to the Holocene, which is the past 12,000 years or so of highly unusual stability in the Earth system. And so what the Anthropocene does, it brings back the potential for potentially catastrophic state shifts in the Earth system. So for example, rapid global warming would constitute one kind of state shift in which we move to an entirely new kind of global system. So that's a big difference. And in terms of well, why we need a book like this, then I think we've taken a look at what other political scientists and others have said about governance and politics in the Anthropocene, and I think in the end, while people have different interesting sorts of things to say, nobody has done a really good and thorough job on what the implications of the Anthropocene are for governance and politics. So that's the basic motivation.
And of course, there's a lot of debates about how we can govern in the age of the Anthropocene. And I think in the book you mentioned there are at least 2 journals that already deal with this particular issue. So I think I'd like to go to Jonathan in terms of, well, what sorts of debates do you engage in the book, and how do you situate your argument in relation to those other debates?
Mm-hmm. Sure, yes. And Nicole, your comment at the start reminded me of the Cole Porter song about you say tomato, I say tomato. You say Anthropocene, I say Anthropocene. But thankfully we didn't.
Is that one of the major debates that you had?
One of the minor ones.
Yeah,
but thankfully
we don't agree on that.
There you go.
But thankfully we didn't call the whole thing off. We did right. Which was a great
it's a meta
experience.
Consensus on pronunciation.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Yeah.
So one of the first questions we address is, well, should we even be talking about the Anthropocene? Yeah. Should we be talking about the capitalist scene, for example? What does it say about the way that we frame the situation that the world is currently in? And there is the critique that the Anthropocene somehow universalises humanity, or suggests that it's humanity as a whole that's influencing the Earth system, without paying attention to the differences, the different drivers of global environmental change and so on. We argue that what we see, these changes in the Earth system, can't be reduced, say, to one particular economic form like capitalism or the like, but they are the product of human influence. But we can recognise that without having to, without overlooking that environmental change is driven by particular groups in societies across the world, and that particular groups are more vulnerable than others to a changing Earth system, whether it's the impacts of climate change or biodiversity loss or the like. So there's that general debate, should we even be talking about the Anthropocene? But then there is also a debate in the emerging literature on the Anthropocene about, well, what sort of Anthropocene are we living in or likely to live in? Is it a good Anthropocene, a bad Anthropocene, or the like? So there are proponents of the bad Anthropocene who characterise the Anthropocene as something that's really best to be avoided, that we should, if at all possible, try and return the Earth to the conditions that prevailed previously in Holocene.
Yeah. And your argument is that's not possible.
Well, yes, that there's no turning the clock back entirely.
Yeah.
We're already committed, for example, to 1 degree at least of climate change. Many species are already irredeemably lost.
Yeah.
So we can't turn the clock back completely. On the other hand, we have the proponents of the good Anthropocene who argue that this is actually something to be embraced. It's a cause for optimism. That human control means that we have all these opportunities to manage the Earth system, whether it's through geoengineering or the like, or nuclear energy. But of course, that often overlooks some of the political challenges associated with this. So we argue instead that the Anthropocene is inescapable. It's not something to be celebrated or lamented, but it's something to be negotiated. And it's something that we as a society and through our political institutions need to continually learn and relearn to live with, because of the instability.
But I wonder how that speaks to contemporary debates about sustainability or resilience. How does your book speak to these bigger debates on environmental politics more generally?
Sure. I can say a little bit about that if you like.
Because you primarily responsible for the chapter on sustainability, so why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Well, in that chapter, we address the question of, well, is sustainability still possible or desirable in the Anthropocene? And we recognise that, say, discourses of sustainability have often been co-opted by vested interests and so on, but that there is still merit in the idea, but we need to rethink sustainability under the changing environmental conditions that we're dealing with at the moment. More generally, though, we argue that the Anthropocene requires political institutions to rethink a range of core values that underpin them. So justice is one of them as well, which we address in that book, and democracy too. So.
And I think that's one of the most interesting things about the book. And of course, this is written by both of you, so there's definitely a strong normative component there. So I guess I wonder whether the book has a strong prescriptive component. When I read the book's description, it says something about the book envisages a world in which humans are no longer estranged from the Earth system, but engage with it in a more, productive relationship. So what does that mean? What sorts of institutional forms does it take? And it sounds very positive in a way. Is that the mood, the ethos of the book?
So it is very normative, but any prescriptions are built on a thorough analysis and evaluation of existing institutions and practices, and so it does. One of the central things it does is try and diagnose what's wrong with existing institutions and forms of governance, and based on that diagnosis, try to develop some principles for how institutions and practices should look instead. However, there is no blueprint. That's not a good way to think about things. I mean, we can imagine all kinds of models about how a political system, an economic system could work and live in harmony with global ecological systems. But the more important task is to start from where we are now, and try and think about how the institutions that have developed under Holocene conditions can be changed in order to produce something more appropriate to the Anthropocene. So the most important requirement for all institutions is, we argue, ecological reflexivity. So reflexivity is essentially the ability of an institution, a set of practices, or even a set of ideas, to reflect upon itself, and if necessary, change basic structure in response to that reflection on performance. So that's the first quality that we should seek in institutions. And that's not something that we can sort of specify on a once and for all basis, and that once we have institutions that are reflexive, and then everything is fine. Reflexivity is instead something that all institutions and practices, sets of ideas, should be striving for, all the time, because the Anthropocene is going to keep springing surprises upon humanity. Yeah. And the important thing is to be able to adjust and change in light of those surprises.
But of course, my empirical mind would ask, what does that look like? What institutional configurations does it have? Or does it go against the spirit of your argument that there are no blueprints?
Mm-hmm. We have some suggestions. So do you want to go through those?
Sure, I can just say a little bit about that. And so one of the key challenges is reconciling the need for institutions to be flexible in their responses to changing conditions, but stable enough to be able to protect long-term interests and provide a platform for whether it's countries or communities to be able to cooperate. And so we put forward this idea of living frameworks as a way of balancing these two ideals. So the idea of living frameworks recalls the idea of a living document, and it's updated over time, but also the idea of a framework for living under unstable conditions. And we contrast that with some of the prevailing institutions that we have that are not very good at listening to signals from ecological change, and we argue that some of these Holocene institutions, although they seem to be very much alive, best characterised as undead or zombie frameworks, given their capacity to devour living things.
Right.
Yeah. So and we then say a little bit as well about some of the specific things that say political institutions, steps that they could take, either to dismantle barriers to reflexivity, so things like eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, or say regulating political donations, and then steps that they could take to build reflexivity, where whether it's engaging citizens more in environmental decision making, or setting up independent bodies that are able to provide credible advice on changes in the Earth system as well. A few of the suggestions that we cover in the final chapter of the book.
Right. So with that kind of argument, I guess the book doesn't just speak to people who care about environmental politics, but it does speak to audiences that work on governance, for example. When I read the book, it does speak to me as someone who does democracy studies as well, because you make all of these arguments about formative agency. Of course, concepts of deliberative democracy make an appearance, I think in chapter 7, Democratic Anthropocene, when you talk about meta-deliberation and all of these virtues of deliberative democracy. Who else does the book speak to?
Yeah, I think the primary audience is probably going to be people who are already interested in environmental governance and politics. But we do have, I think we do have lots to say beyond that. But even sort of conceptualizing environmental politics and governance as a niche subfield is I think a mistake. We do say at one point that we believe that from now on all politics should be a politics of the Anthropocene. That has to be that ecological reflexivity is the first virtue of social and political institutions. So in that sense, it's not supposed to be a book that interests only niche interests in environmental governance. It's about governance in its entirety. I mean, my own feeling is that political science should be redefined as a subfield of Earth system governance, and that in the same way that politics is just a subsystem of the Earth system in its entirety. And then we do say lots of things about democracy, about justice, and so forth. So that should interest people who are interested in those things in particular.
Right. And of course, there's a lot more to cover. But for now, I guess my final question would be, what's the hardest part in terms of writing this book?
Well, I think it was actually deciding on the book cover.
Right.
Tell us about I don't know, our cameraman is kindly showing a little preview of the cover itself. It shows a sculpture by Jason DeCare Taylor, which is actually called Anthropocene, and this was the cover that we ended up with after who knows how many different options were canvassed of aerial shots of highways and seawalls and various other things. but we like this one partly because it's a sculpture, an underwater sculpture of a man or a person sleeping on a car. So partly it recalls the idea of, well, say, humanity's embrace of the fossil fuel economy, but perhaps also the idea of humanity being asleep at the wheel in the face of all this changes going on. At the same time, we've got the fish swimming in front of the sculpture as well, which are a reminder of the natural world. And it was also interesting to us too that the sculpture itself is made with a type of concrete that is supposed to allow coral to form on it as well. So perhaps creating novel ecosystems along the way.
Or just with the cover, they're so
profound.
already. Well, so the book is now available for pre-order, if I'm not mistaken, at the Oxford University Press website. I also checked it at Book Depository this morning, so it's there available for pre-order. So it's at $32. So I think for everyone interested in these issues, it's a particularly important book to purchase for Christmas and of course for library subscriptions. For now, we'll leave it there. Congratulations again, John and Jonathan, for this book. And watch out for the next episodes of our book drop series. Thanks for watching.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.